During the past few years, almost all mid-engine Ferraris increased in value, but that's no longer the case. The Ferrari market broke in two segments. In the first segment, prices continued to increase while they decreased in the other segment. And this development is similar to what we can see in other markets. During the pandemic, everything increased. But now that things are slowly returning back to normal, some cars are dropping much quicker than others. Let's figure out which cars belong to the first group, the one for which prices continue to increase, and which cars belong to the second group, the one for which prices decreased. But as always, we'll first have a look at the current market. Over here we have the US market at the end of June. And this means that this video and most of the other videos on the channel cover the US market. Many of you requested videos about other markets, and this is something that's in the pipeline. But it will only gradually appear on the channel. First the UK market and then the German one. But let's get back to the Ferrari market. We can see that there are 760 cars listed for sale, and this is approximately the same as 3 months ago. Supply stabilized during the summer. When I talk about supply, I mean supply for the mid-engine models that are listed here. The front-engine cars will be covered in a separate video. Now looking at the prices, we can see that there's a big variation. You can get a mid-engine Ferrari for $85,000, but prices go up to $1 million for the Apertas. In between those two extremes, we can see familiar price levels. 360s are the cheapest. High mileage cars start at $85,000. F355s are slightly more expensive and are now in the same price range as the F430. The gap between the F430 and the 458 is still significant, while the price difference between the 458 and 488 is still decreasing. Look at that. 458s, which are newer than 2013, are priced at the same level as the oldest 488s. F8s are an enormous step up, and the SF90s are probably out of reach for most of us. Ironically though, they have the highest depreciation rates. Even though that these prices aren't too distinct from the ones 3 months ago, the post-pandemic price trends are becoming increasingly evident. Increasing price trends mainly consist out of older cars and a few special models, while decreasing price trends are visible for the newer cars. Starting with the F355, we can see that the price trend is strong. This car does then also belong to the first group. If you watched last week's video, it doesn't come as a surprise. The F355 namely made it to the top 4 cars for which prices increased. If we focus on the Spider only, because that is the only segment for which supply is reasonable, we can see that prices increased by 11.9% or $12,400 during last year. However, the confidence intervals are high, showing a high price uncertainty. It's simply the result of the small market size. Yet, we can see that the bottom value remained constant and that the top one increased. It's namely not the complete market for which prices increased. Prices mainly went up for cars with less than roughly 20,000 miles. Prices for the high mileage cars decreased slightly. So it's important to do your research if you're in the market for an F355. Let's have a look now at the 360 market. Over here we have the price trend split by transmission type and excluding the Challenge Stradalis. Looking at the automatics, we can see that the price trend is exceptionally strong. Moreover, also the 360 made it to last week's video, in which I showed you the cars for which prices are still increasing. We can see that, in general, prices followed the market during the pandemic. They surged. In 2022 the increase stopped temporarily, yet it wasn't a market top. Prices continued to increase after September 2022, up to a point where you had to pay $112,000 for a 360. And this means that they are 9.5% or roughly $10,000 more expensive than 1 year ago. That's a very strong result indeed. Now it's much more difficult to analyze the manual market due to its small size. You can see that the confidence intervals are large, and this indicates a high price uncertainty. If we look at the confidence interval, we can see that the market appears to be a bit weaker than the one for the automatics. Prices also stabilized in the summer of last year, but we cannot see a continuation of the increase. If anything, we can see a small decrease. Nevertheless, due to the strength of the automatic market and the size of that market versus the manual market, I think it's fair to also categorize the 360 in the first group. That is, the group for which prices continue to increase. And that brings us to the F430, a very interesting market. It namely falls exactly between the older and the newer cars, also when it comes to the price trends. Over here we can see that prices soared during the pandemic, but stabilized during last year. Based on the median prices, the cars dropped 6.8%. But this number doesn't represent what actually happened, as some of these fluctuations are the result of changes in the market composition. You can then also see that the confidence intervals are more stable. Correcting for the changes in the market composition, prices dropped by 2 to 3%. That change is so small that I think it's fair to conclude that F430 prices remained stable during last year. Based on this, the F430 doesn't really fall in any of the two groups we talked about. It sits somewhere in the middle. The Scuderia market and also the Challenge Stradale market for that matter are too small to analyze, so we'll skip those price trends. And that brings us to the more modern stuff, the 458. The last of its kind, and for a while, buying a 458 equated to making a good short-term investment. However, that doesn't hold anymore. Price trends turned. But before we have a look at those price trends, if you enjoyed this video or find it helpful in your buying or selling process, please support the channel by clicking on the like button down below. Thank you. Over here we have the 458 price trends split by the coupes and the spiders. And look at that change in market dynamics. Between April 2020 and June 2022, prices went nuts. They increased by 37% or $65,000 in the coupe market and by almost 50% or $99,000 in the spider market. This last number is a bit of an overestimation, but the numbers are impressive nonetheless. However, as we can all see, June 2022 marked the market top. Prices declined in line with most other cars. Compared to last year, coupes are down by 8.8% or $21,000 and spiders by 11.1% or $33,300. Now looking at the price development between Q1 and Q2 of this year, we can see that especially spider prices bottomed, but this is mainly the result of a change in market composition. Prices indeed fell less quickly, but the increase that you see over here is an overestimation. The 458 therefore definitely falls into the second category, the one that contains the cars with decreasing prices. If we transition then to the Speciales, we can see even crazier price dynamics. A 60% increase between April 2020 and March 2022. Prices really took off. Since the summer of 2022 though, prices have been relatively stable. We can see that the market bottom fluctuated at approximately $550,000. At the top end we find some excesses, and these could be very well driven by high-spec cars. Therefore, I think it's fair to state that the Speciales fall in between the two categories. Prices were relatively stable during last year. Now the boom and bust pattern that we saw in the normal 458 market is also visible in the 488 market. Surprisingly, price trends are highly correlated. Given the specialness of the 458, this isn't something that's self-evident. Just as in the 458 market, prices increased between July 2022 and June 2022. Though, increase rates are slightly lower at 23%. The decreases that followed are exactly the same as in the 458 market. Prices dropped by 8.8% in the coupe market and by 11.1% in the spider market. Therefore, the 488 belongs to the second group. The price trend is clearly down. We can also see that the price development during the last 3 months was slightly more positive, something that we also saw in other markets. Even pista prices are down. Not by much though. Coupes are down by 6.8% and spiders by 8.7%. Similar to the normal 488s, the short-term trend appears to be down. Now after all those graphs for the more modern Ferraris, I think you know what's going on in the F8 and the SF90 market. Prices are down and those cars definitely belong to the second group. Starting with the F8, we can see that prices fell by 7.3% in the coupe market and by 13.2% in the spider market. Due to the high prices, this already amounts to $32,000 and $74,000. On the flip side though, just as we saw in the 488 market, we can see that prices decreased less quickly during the last 3 months. Moving on to the SF90, we can see that this is by a large margin the quickest depreciating mid-engine Ferrari. Prices dropped by 19.2% during last year, and this amounts to $165,000. I'm not sure if there are any SF90 owners among you who care about values, but if there are, the worst might be over. High mileage 2020 cars lost the lowest amount ever during the most recent 3 months. The mid-engine Ferrari market broke into two segments, one in which prices are still going up and one in which price trends are clearly down. In the first segment we find the F355 and the 360. In the second one we find the normal 458s, the 488s, the F8s and the SF90s. Prices for the F430 and 458 Specialis were relatively stable. They therefore fall in between the two categories. Now these price dynamics reveal that things are very slowly returning back to normal when it comes to depreciation patterns. New cars are depreciating, and the older the car, the lower the depreciation rate. This dynamic was self-evident before the pandemic, but was falsified during the last 2 years. Nevertheless, the Ferrari market is still relatively strong. Excluding the SF90, year-over-year decreases vary between roughly 8 and 11%, and this is slightly less than what we can observe in other markets. And with that we arrived at the end of this video. Now if you enjoyed this data-driven way of analyzing car markets, but would like to see a video for a different car, head over to my channel. Over there you will find market analysis for a large variety of cars. Can't find the car you're looking for? Let me know the name of the car by commenting it down below in the comment section. Once there are enough requests for a certain car, I'll make a video about it. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next week for a new video.